Hi, everybody. I'm here with Gary Cohen from Practical Agility. Gary's been an executive in engineering for almost 30 years. Gary, correct me if I'm wrong. Gary is an agile coach now and trains a lot of teams how to get better at their craft. And we connecting today to talk about a lot of topics in the industry right now that are hot. That's the story of this podcast, to expose some of the biggest challenges in the industry and what is it that we can do about it. Gary, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Alex. It's great to be here and great to get a chance to talk with you.
Thank you. Likewise, excited to have you here. I wanted to share a little bit of your background with the audience or anybody that could be watching. Could you introduce yourself? People would probably love to know a little bit more about your background.
Sure, yeah. I've been in the industry a long time, as Alex said. I think he threw out the 30-year number, which makes me feel really old. It's true,
Sorry, I
but
had to.
yeah, we're all about the truth here. But I have a technical background, right? So I've been an engineer, software developer, been focused around software development throughout my whole career. I started off doing consulting. I was part of a big consulting company, spent a few years in financial institutions, more of the traditional IT, internal IT. And then for 20 years, worked for software product companies and led teams and groups and organizations there, which really has influenced my thinking in terms of how do we provide value for customers, how do we deliver value in our software, how do we deliver it consistently. And so I've had responsibility for engineering and QA as well as product. I think I have a different perspective. If you're used to hearing from traditional Agile people, I have a slightly different path than they did. I came to Agile just as a way to produce better software. It wasn't like it was a means to an end. It wasn't important in and of itself that we were doing Agile. It just so happened we thought it was helpful. And so in the last couple of years where I've gotten more into the traditional agile industrial complex, let's call it, I have the most admiration for folks who are driving agile practices and lean practices and things like that. But it's just one of many tools that we should be using to drive business outcomes and create high performing teams and have happy customers.
I actually was going to ask you, like, what led up to you all of a sudden taking on the agile coaching and your entry into the field. So what are you hearing out there? There's lots of different topics. Obviously, people talk about AI a lot. We're not going to discuss it on the show. It seems to be an overwhelming topic that's pretty recurring. But there's this huge movement that I feel is the pink elephant in the room. And I'm using the same phrase again, pink elephant. The agile works or agile doesn't work. Scrum works or Scrum doesn't work. There's a whole big discreditation movement that says, you know what, everything we've been doing in the past 20 years as a discipline is no good anymore. And I think it's sending waves across. What's your take on that?
So I think overall, the introduction of agile practices has been a big positive to how we develop software. Is it always introduced or used in a manner that provides value? No. Does it always provide value? No. But like, for example, I've been in places where I came in and they were already doing lots of ceremonies, but they didn't understand why they were doing them or what they were supposed to be getting out of them. They had no ownership in them, and therefore it wasn't really having a positive effect. So I think doing agile for agile's sake or to say that you're agile is not real helpful. I think applying agile practices along with lean practices and product practices, UX practices, DevOps practices, organizational design practices, when you put them together and use them in the right moments, then that makes a lot of sense. I will bring up, I think one big issue I have with what we've decided to focus on in the agile world is we've mostly been focused on the delivery side, which the delivery is really important, right? It's the last stage, right? And that's where you actually produce the thing that once it's in the customer's hands will produce value and what they pay for. And hey, I'm up for efficiency just as much as the next person. So we focus a lot of times on the efficiency of delivery. And that's all well and good, but like two things. If we're working on the wrong stuff, then doing it more efficiently or doing it better doesn't really help. We're just doing the wrong thing faster.
Yeah, there's a statement doing things right is not as important as doing the right things.
Right thing. Exactly. Yes. And so, given that, like with all the time that we all spend, whether it's Scrum Masters, Agile coaches, Agile teams, executives, we're all focused in on the how we deliver it, and we don't bring the same sorts of practices and analysis and focus to are we working on the right things?
So
And so
outcomes versus outputs.
outcomes versus outputs, yes, 100%. And also just where's the most uncertainty? There's uncertainty throughout the whole process. We don't always know what's the best way to implement something. We don't know how long it's going to take to implement something. But I would propose that there's a lot more uncertainty in what we should build than in those other questions.
Well, yeah, I share your thoughts. With my experience, it's been about the same thing. There is the push to get something done that far supersedes the thoughts of, hold on a second, let's evaluate what is it that we don't have to do. An example that comes to mind is I worked for a company where my team was building an export feature out of the application, but they were selling a data product and they were struggling with the churn. People would sign up, use the platform, then they would bail. And one of the biggest features the customer requested was the ability to do bulk export. When I came together with my team around this requirement, it was a technical requirement, and I was an architect at the time. The challenge was that I pointed out if we're struggling with churn, but we're making it easier for customers to pull the data in Excel and working outside the system, then by definition, our system is not valuable. And I try to fight product, if you will, at rethinking how we can deliver more value in the platform than a customer would get outside of the platform. I was not successful, but it's one of those idiosyncrasies which I think happens all the time. Customers asking for feature which is not meeting what you need, and you're missing the opportunity to create more value and hence making the wrong decision. The company's not been doing well since I was there, and I think one of the biggest reasons is the user experience just doesn't connect well with the strategy and what the user needs. So it would be probably one of the examples where I think outputs are not as important as outcomes.
Yes, and in that particular case, right, there are a couple of things. You number one, you made it easier for them to go outside of your system, right, which probably isn't the best use of your resources, right? When you could have been spending the time to make it more compelling for them to stay in the product, which is what you were proposing. Yeah.
Exactly. And when the customer's asking, hey, we got so much data that we want to export that we got to do it in the background and we got to get links whenever a huge file is available. Like you're creating a complex exporting functionality, but for the wrong benefit. So I guess that speaks volume. So what's your take on agile works or doesn't work from an executive perspective? Because one of the things that we find is a lot of the agile coaches have never sat in the executive chair. They've never been a VP of engineering, CTO, like you have been in your career. And I'm curious if you put in your executive hat and evaluate against where the industry is right now, how do you look at it? Is it important? How the team gets the job done? Is it as critical as long as they do it? Or is the execution and the style of execution is important?
So I don't think from a methodology standpoint, it really matters what methodology you use or whether different teams use somewhat different. One team might use Kanban, another team might use Scrum, what have you. That certainly from an executive standpoint, like even as a technical executive who's very immersed in Agile and believes in it, again, there's not one size fits all, number one. Number two, we talked about outcomes. We're really concerned with outcomes, not the way that we get there as much. I do think that there are a couple of kind of universal principles, though, that are helpful when you're trying to be adaptive and agile in the adjective form, not the verb or noun form. But like number one, breaking up work into small pieces, right? Mm-hmm. That helps you get feedback more quickly and to learn. When you put it into working software, and that's your ultimate test of things, right? We find out things when people actually use software that we don't necessarily find out before then. So those are really important things. Working cross-functional teams is really important. It minimizes handoffs. It gives us a diversity of perspectives, right? Working together. And it gives us a shared context, especially if you compare that with group incentive or joint incentives, right? To incentivize the whole team focusing on the outcomes, right? And the product goals and things like that. Those things are really good practices. As an executive, I'd encourage them. But there's not one right way to do it, and it's different in every environment.
So if I'm hearing correct, what you're essentially saying is the discipline itself is great for the teams themselves, how they manage the work, how they manage their responsibilities. There's a certain standard way to run the practice. However, from the executive perspective, it sounds like as long as they get the job done, it's not really important. So when does the execution become important?
I think that there are a couple of issues. So number one, I want to see that there's a healthy recognition of all the uncertainty that's out there. I never really liked the status meetings, whether program status, product status, whatever, where red, yellow, green. I know the meme is that's all that executives care about is green, yellow, red. They have short attention spans. But first of all, we know that's all theater anyway.
I like that. I like that.
Yeah. And especially depending on the level of psychological safety, but even when there's a decent amount of psychological safety, you go into those meetings and you're telling the executive what you think they want to hear, not what they need to hear. So that's number one. In most places, anyway.
I think I would wholeheartedly agree with you. Being the man in the middle between the teams and the executive, you have to prove your self-worth almost every single time you get in front of the audience and maybe take the opportunity to show the best results. So there's quite a lot of emotions there. There's fear. There's so many different aspects in that communication.
Right. So there's a couple problems with it, though. Number one, in those types of meetings, we're only focused on one kind of risk, right? Which is schedule or delivery risk, mm-hmm. right? We're not asking questions about whether we're building the right stuff, going back to our earlier theme, right? All we're really saying is, are we going to deliver this fixed set of things at the time that we thought at the beginning of the project we thought we could do it in, which is the worst time to figure that out anyway. But it's even worse than that because, like we said, people want to impress the executives and they think that impressing them means looking good and having everything on track. And so you wind up with, everything's green. And then you get to 3 weeks before the deadline, right? And then all of a sudden it's red. And so you wind up with watermelon projects, right? A project's a watermelon project if it's green on the outside and red on the inside. And as an executive, if I'm going to deal with schedule and delivery risk, and I'm going to invest my time to this, I want it to at least be meaningful and for us to discuss things as they really are. That's true transparency. But if people are afraid, if they feel like that's not what the leader is looking for, then they're just going to throw this status up and then it becomes a waste of time. But I'll go even beyond that, right? Because all we're looking at is schedule and delivery stuff. And second of all, in a lot of these meetings, people spend 90% of the time just sharing information, which should be freely available and accessible in whatever work visualization tool you're using. And so why not? And I don't know if executives will look at it. Guess what? I used to look at it, right? Because I don't want to wait to the status meeting to know if we're going off kilter or whatever, number one. And number two, it's just a waste. We were already in too many meetings, so why waste our meeting time, especially meeting time with executives who hopefully have some guidance, understanding of the business and the business objectives to share with you. So wouldn't it be better if instead we focused on what have we learned since the last time we met? What were the key things we didn't know that we said we wanted to find out more about? Assumptions we want to test, hypotheses, right? Things like that. And what have we learned? And then based on what we've learned, have we decided to like make any changes based off of that, right? That would be a really interesting discussion to have.
Lots of teams, they're actually are afraid to voice their opinion, or sometimes they do, but they get shielded by the middle manager or product managers. Like they don't have the exposure to the customers lots of times. So the teams can have their own opinions. Sometimes it's correct opinion, sometimes it's not. So it's really hard to gauge the sort of function or dysfunction of the layer right above the team and before the executive level, because there are conversations that developers are never privy to, and they happen behind closed doors with the long lists of things being put on the backlog that nobody really knows the reason for.
So let's talk about that.
Yeah.
So let's talk about two things. Number one is how we bring developers and the whole Scrum team into some of those conversations to get a better context. And then if we remember, I then also like to talk about backlogs. But like, I've always been a big believer in bringing customers into the room, like literally bringing them into the room. That was pre-pandemic. Now, post-pandemic, bringing them into the Zoom, the Google Meet, whatever software you happen to use for that sort of stuff. But because we do want the people who are actually building the software to understand what the customer problems are, how they are or might use their software, and having a maybe relationship is too strong a word, but personal relationship, even if it's just through sprint reviews or whatever, and hearing about if you see somebody like jumping up for joy when you show something that you just have put into the product, right, this past sprint, like that's pretty visceral, right? And then maybe they'll even tell you why they're so happy. And it works the other way if they're like pounding the table angrily or they look bored when all these things are really important to absorb. And then if you can take it even further and say, hey, maybe the Scrum team should have some involvement in product discovery as well, right? And I've seen that done in many models. There's the model where you just have the product trio, which is the lead tech, the lead product, and the lead UX folks together, and they do product discovery a weekly or whatever basis together. That helps disintermediate a little bit, but I've also seen where anybody on the team can go sit in on different UX sessions or things like that, or product brainstorming. I think that's important.
There's a couple of things here. Not everybody's going to get a chance to sit with a customer side by side or maybe in the meeting room, right? There's just so many things to do in a day, and you can't bring in half of the company to talk to a customer. I think what can be done is you could always share a conversation, maybe a podcast, maybe just an interview with a customer, maybe like a discussion about challenges. So I think the big part is relating to the problem, because when we listen to the information, we will all hear something different. And then what we want to do is discuss what have you heard versus what I understood, because there's many ideas and maybe you can compromise on stuff. But I think giving more ownership to the teams to help with the direction setting is always beneficial. Even the requirements themselves, and I know you wanted to talk about backlog items, which is always a fun topic, but the discussion even in the requirements. So depending how you form the phrasing of the requirement, if you form it in the problem statement, then you might get a solution that you didn't want. For example, let's say we use my example about the export. Somebody says, I want to export a list of things in the CSV file or Excel sheet. We can do an export of the screen, so like a screen grab, and only that. We can do an export of the whole query. We don't know how many records somebody's going to export. We can create a limit. Let's say a limit is 100, or we could say we're going to pull all of the results out of the system that match that specifying parameter. So if you define loose requirements, engineers may come up with the wrong thing. But if you put a little bit more rigidity around the requirement, then you're basically leaning towards a solutioning. So there's always this weird way, like how much into solutioning do I want to offer the engineers? And the best way is to expose customers into the conversation.
Agreed, 100%. And I think asking the question why, like, why would we, what are we trying to accomplish? What's the purpose behind it? And that's really important because then you can get everybody's perspective towards a solution, and can have more conversations about what it is we're really trying to accomplish, right? And that's where refinement sessions can be really helpful, is the conversations that you have and the trade-offs, and are we really making progress towards the business outcomes or the product goals. Another thing that I found is helpful is, I don't know if you're familiar with opportunity solution trees. Teresa Torres
A little bit.
has popularized them. The key thing there is that you're keeping a list of options. You're starting with the business outcome on top, and then potential opportunities where we think as a business we can help solve a customer need, want, pain, whatever. And then from there we break it down, and eventually we get to, for this to work, here are the critical things that would need to be true with various levels of confidence in how likely that is. And if we focus in on like where we are in terms of learning and validating or invalidating these assumptions and looking at both the problem and all the potential solutions together, and that's an artifact that anybody can look at, right, at any time. And I think that helps people keep the problem in mind, right, that we're trying to solve for. So I think that's very important.
But then I got to take a little bit of the devil's advocate stance here. I remember
Please.
being an engineer, right? And as engineer, I would take a look at a product backlog item and I would read it and I'm like, oh my God, this is very important, but I know how to do this. I'm going to just jump right in. I'm going to get it done real quick. Everybody's going to be super impressed. I have my own, I guess, ego to satisfy, and I want to gain a reputation as this great developer. So I'm just going to pick
Mm-hmm.
it up and I'm just going to do it real quick. I think I understand it. I'm not going to ask any questions because, unfortunately, not all engineers ask questions. Some just like to be told exactly what to do. And I'm just going to code it up and then I'm going to bring it on the platter. And this is when we're going to find out that's not what's needed. So this happens as well. Here's the funny part, right? If you do a lot of questioning on why, then you're almost becoming this renegade, right? If you're just doing what you're told, then you're just blindly following orders. And I think this balance for engineers is very hard to keep because sometimes just the simple path is enough. Don't overcomplicate it. And other times it's just not enough depth. And even though an engineer interpreted it as a cookie cutter, just get it done, but find out there's so many questions that were not picked up by the requirement. And how do we solve that problem?
I think there's a couple of things. So number one is in the conversations that we have, whether that's refinement sessions, whether that's discovery or not in discovery, but wherever we have those discussions, right, we need to get a sense from each other as to, we know we need to do this, right? And it's pretty simple and straightforward. So go do your thing versus there's a lot of uncertainty here. Either we don't know how to do it, or there's three different ways we could do it.
Or more
Right.
than three?
Exactly. And so that's where it's really important to have these conversations and to, let's not forget our agile principles, right? Work iteratively. So rather than go off and come back however many week later, 2 weeks later, whatever, on the silver platter, golden platter, whatever that you were mentioning, right, is let's do a first version, like a very light version, just end to end. And then let's check back in, collaborate, like cross-functionally. And when we do that, we get feedback quickly. So we've all been on projects, or we've all been in situations, even when we were the engineers, where we go off for 2-3 weeks, go work on something, come back, and the look on whoever's face who asked us to go do it was like, what did you do there? That's not what I wanted. And we can avoid those things by checking in on a frequent basis and working in really small chunks. So I think that's one thing that we can do. I think there was a lot of ego and individualism that you mentioned, like in the scenario you were painting, which in some environments is very prevalent, and in other environments it's just natural. It pops up every now and again. And so, how do we encourage collaboration? Another way to do that is to have a very small work in progress set, right? A work in progress limit, so that you're almost forcing people to work together. Number one, because there's less work in your work in progress than there are a number of people. But number two, when you're constraining their ability to go work on the next thing, they're going to be very focused on finishing the stuff they're already working on so that they can go to the next thing.
I agree with you. I think the teams pick up way more work in a lot of different areas than they need to. They spread themselves thin, even in decision making. And I think that's another problem at the leadership level, that everybody seems to be wanting to optimize sort of your hands on the keyboard, while instead, my dad always taught me, measure 7 times, cut once, right? And the less that we can do simultaneously, the more our focus is on a specific problem, the entire pattern of flow and just makes things easier to execute with a lot less mistakes. But again, to your point, it's hard to design such a structure within the teams. Executives typically don't delegate it, right? They run things by numbers and they rely on the teams to come up with their own practice. I think this is probably where you wish it was picked up at a senior level and guided the teams through the execution a proper way. And I don't know if there's any triggers besides failure that indicate the need to revisit how things are done.
If you can cultivate a culture of experimentation and of using metrics as guardrails, then let's start to take a look at what's causing that.
I like it. You use the word metrics. I think in product delivery, and at least from product perspective,
please don't use
the what? No, I'm not going towards velocity. That's a curse word. I'm going to bleep it out of this recording afterwards. No, I'm leaning more towards, in product delivery, there are 2 things that people celebrate as success: number of things delivered and timelines under which they are delivered. Both of these things are superficial, self-imposed metrics. Number of things delivered obviously does not meet the outcome versus output. So it measures the output, right, and that's wrong, but that's where people get big bonuses. Hey, we've just delivered 350 new items in a year. However, you take a look at the tech debt and you learn that you've just delivered 300 tech debt items in addition to that, because we were so fast that we really didn't revisit anything. The other thing is the speed of delivery. Sometimes it's important because you have an actual customer waiting for it, and there might be realized revenue or something else, some other opportunities that are critical for the date. But I think those are also self-imposed. I've never seen a customer being like really spot on and say, if you don't deliver this, we're not gonna work with you anymore. If it's a good customer with a good relationship, probably there are ways to mitigate that. Most likely, people don't want to put you in a situation where you can't deliver. And they understand that even the partner can run into challenges. So I think that can be tackled. Where it's a problem is if you make a promise and you don't hear from them up until the delivery time, and then you find out that you can't deliver something to the customer. That's when the problems usually arise, because people are betting their jobs on something being done. They are planning initiatives based on where they're going to be. Maybe they have additional revenue targets or anything else that relies on it. So obviously that's going to ruffle quite a few feathers. So what's your take on the overall metrics? I think every department, or I should probably not say department, but every role in product development has their own metrics that they get measured by, that they get celebrated by, get bonuses, raises, etc., promotions.
Yeah. So that's part of the problem, is that they all have separate incentives. If you want true alignment, which you should if you're trying to work across a value stream and you're concerned with business outcomes, you actually want them to have the same incentives so that they're incentivized to work together, and that they're only going to get the bonus if you reach the business outcome. And I know that there are pros and cons in terms of, hey, I'm over here and I don't have full control over us reaching that. But guess what? Should be why we're forming these teams, right, and working together is to achieve this business outcome. And part of what makes us really valuable to our team and to the company is our ability to work together, no matter what our role, to achieve the overall outcome. Incentives play a huge part in that. The other thing that you said that really brought my antenna up was making promises, right? And whether it's, especially anytime you make a promise to somebody, you probably need to
Keep it.
make sure that you deliver on it, right? Otherwise, you're not going to have the trust that you need to work collaboratively. But you have to be especially careful making promises to customers or to prospects for many reasons. But I think that's where I have the most problem with the typical product backlog.
We're really going to have the product backlog discussion. Okay, let's jump.
Just from this point, at least, anyway, right? Which is anytime something gets put onto the product backlog, if that's viewed as a commitment to somebody to eventually get that done, then I have a huge problem with it. We talk about being agile and having the ability to adapt. How are you going to do that when you've just mortgaged away all your future capacity for who knows how long, depending on how big your backlog is? Now, if you treat your backlog as here are things we might work on, right, then that's a different viewpoint and that might be okay.
You're right. In my experience, being an engineer and running lots of teams. So here's a very layman's example, right? You put a product backlog item, let's say to do a feature, and you are driving user experience first. So you give it to the designers, come up with something amazing. The UI UX is fantastic. And then you hand it off to the team. The team plays around with it. It's done. Went through all the validations. You're there for the PM review. You look at it, and for the lack of a better word, it's crap. It's awkward. The amount of buttons, it's inconsistent with the overall look and feel. It looks great on paper. It might even feel good on the mock-up, a functional mock-up. But then once you start playing around with it and you start realizing, oh, it's not really working that way. Or better yet, maybe you're doing some analytics on the screen and you find out that's not how customers use it. So what do you do then? Do you mark that feature as completed and stick around with all the dysfunctional engineering? Or do you iterate again? You now learn from it and you can make improvement. So the deadline itself can't be used, because if you make that decision too close to the cutoff, you basically lose the ability to compromise. And we always learn how to make things better. And I have this saying, software development or product development is like remodeling. You can never finish. You can only stop. Right? We can iterate forever on something. From the architecture side, when I was an architect, I always spoke with the teams and they said, we got to immediately solve the performance problem. I go, which performance problem? While you're designing a new feature, there's no performance problem. Get it working first. Learn, put in the metrics, measure. If you start detecting performance problem, then we can solve it later, because you're anticipating a certain type of utilization, which you may not have. You should obviously practice in the engineering the most optimal way of doing things, but solve problems that are there. Don't solve anticipating problems that may not ever surface. And also don't over-engineer for them, because it may be very simple. If a user clicks a button, do you care that a pigeon flies out across the world and delivers a note, as long as it does it in the time you expect it and to the right recipient, right? Or there's a system with electronics that basically delivers the same message in the same time. You really don't care as a user. You don't care if there's magic dust doing the execution. But what you care about is that the user experiences what they wanted.
So you should use good practices, as you said, but you shouldn't optimize too early, because you don't know whether you're going to need to. You don't know whether, like you said, that it's going to resonate with the customer anyway. So it may not be something that stays in the product or really needs to scale if 3 people are using it. So totally agree with that. You actually had me at pigeon. I don't know that, like,
Oh, really?
come up
Okay.
in many conversations. No. So that's all true. So I think don't box yourself into a corner. Yeah, the idea is there's a lot. When we build a feature or part of a feature, we should know ahead of time, and this is really falls on probably under products domain, but why are we doing this, not just in terms of the overall customer retention, increased revenue, but what sort of behavior change do we think that this feature is going to, what's going to make it successful? If we reduce the average number of clicks from 5 to 3, is it that 50% of the users use this new workflow, whatever the case may be? And we should decide that upfront before we ever commit to developing that feature, for two reasons. Number one, so that we all understand why we're doing it and what's the outcome we're trying to drive to. That will help the engineers and UX and everybody else in trying to figure out what's enough work on that. But number two, after the fact, when it goes out to customers, we don't suffer from the bias of we didn't set a metric beforehand. And so now, you know what, that was probably worth it doing that or keeping it in the product. But if we set it beforehand, then there is no bias. It's just either we're getting the expected result or we're not. So I think that's important too. And so maybe that also triggers performance like optimization. If, okay, we notice that people started to click into this, but then they got bogged down somewhere, and it turns out that's because it was taking too long for this page to load or this or that, or too many people were using. Okay, then we can go back and go super optimized for that.
The modern engineering versus how we've coded things before, we have lots of logging outputs. We do dashboards, we do like Kibanas, Grafana's, etc. So the developers actually can monitor real-time environments, including utilization, memory, clicking, API calls, latencies in a much more robust ways than we did before. Before it used to be one of those, the customer reported the page loads too slow. And then we're digging in trying to figure out why.
And like to the extent that instrumentation is already there just because it's general purpose, then great. And I think that's table stakes. But to the extent that when we create a new feature, we ought to factor some sort of at least base level instrumentation. Part of the definition of done, right?
That's usually done in modern practice. Back when I was just a developer, that was pretty rare. When number one, we didn't have the tools. Number two, that wasn't the typical norm. But today, getting a certain feature delivered talks about everything from product marketing metrics, like how does somebody use the platform, where they're clicking, what are they doing, the ability to monitor what's happening on the back end, all the API calls, the dev tools in a browser, the efficiency. But back in the day, we just monitor two things, CPU and the memory.
Yep. So let me ask you a question, because you brought up a good point. When you were talking about we deliver the initial version of a feature or whatever, and we start to get feedback, or we see, you know what, this wasn't exactly what we wanted, and we need to go to version 2, whatever. And then I want you to think about any roadmap you've ever seen, right? Or any plan you've ever seen. Tell me, where are the gaps in between where there's nothing planned, where we have the time to go back and go do these things?
We don't. And companies struggle with two things. Teams, not even companies, but teams struggle with two things. Number one, getting the tech debt done. Nobody seems to have it. It's always shoved down to the bottom. It's always some kind of a non-functional requirement the product manager overlooks. It's down in the bottom of the list. And so is the iterative. You got to find the spot. And obviously, with anything that you insert into your plan in front of the other work is going to push the rest of the things out. We typically don't allocate these time buckets. Or some teams do, and they try to say, hey, X percentage of the time you're going to dedicate towards this. But I think that's superficial. X percentage of the time, that percentage is going to shrink the moment something more important comes around. We typically do the planning based on concrete plans, but what we don't do is account for the environment, in which case we constantly have to reprioritize. So the just-in-time prioritization is something that's overlooked, even for the Scrum teams. The Scrum teams, a lot of times, are run in a way that sprints in advance are being planned, and almost nothing gets dropped. And then everybody wonders, what do you do with the carryover? There's arguments about the carryover itself. Is carryover bad or good? If you picked up something and you didn't get it done, is it painful that you had to bring it into the next sprint? Like, Some teams pick that up as a failure. No, it isn't. It's just a standard way of doing things. Something else got in the way. Learn, discover for what reason. But you're right. There is never a gap.
I've seen both of those things, right? And I've seen the battle between the product person features and the tech lead or engineering manager or whatever on tech debt. And I've actually seen like when the groups view themselves as being in a single boat, so to speak, and they're either going to make it to the other side together or not. And when there's a lot of psychological safety, I've seen groups work out a nice balance there. Not saying
But I
right,
think
but
most of them struggle with this all the time.
well, yeah, there's a tension there. But if it's a creative tension, like if it's and there's good conversation and you reach good decisions about the balance there, and it is a balance, it is a polarity, right? Then absolutely, it's definitely a challenge for most people. I'm just saying that that one I've actually seen solved. What I've never seen solved is the right with any plan or roadmap that we have. It's back to back to back stuff, which leaves no room for deviation or to spend more time. In theory, there is, and I've worked on teams where we understood that this is just based on what we know today.
Well, this is where plans are treated as promises, right? And if you make a promise, then we add the metric of product manager delivering as their success factor. And you compound the fact that iterating and output is measured more than the outcome, then obviously it's going to skew the picture towards a very directive based execution of things without the ability to iterate, which is essentially more waterfally if you think about it, not from the planning perspective and or requirements gathering, if you will, but more from the execution. Like we just do things in order, we don't iterate. Because the agility means changing direction and with ease. And if you're not
Right.
able to change that direction with ease, for that portion, the team is just not being agile.
Exactly, right? So we want loosely held plans, we want loosely held roadmaps. We want to I think we want to make planning and road mapping as cheap and easy as possible so that we do it more often. So number one, because it's so easy to do, we don't feel like we have this big sunk cost in it. And number two, that gets us into more of a forecast. This is what we know today, right? Then we're going to do a little bit of work. We're going to collect a little data, and then we're going to go revisit it. Is this still the right path for us? Should we be doing more of this, less of this, and none of that? And so that's why things that emphasize learning and adaptation, so like the opportunity solution tree, forces you to think in terms of options as opposed to there's one way to go do this. But it's a huge cultural shift. And again, this is another place where with leadership, you have to be very careful about what you incentivize. When you incentivize the wrong thing, so you could say all you want, oh, we want to be an agile company, we want to be able to adapt, react to change, but I'm going to hold you to that schedule no matter what, and your bonus is based on it.
Yeah, which goes back again to the metrics. I have a question for you. Whenever you give a lot of power to the teams to come up with the feedback, you're creating a community. And usually, community decisions are extremely difficult because everybody needs to be reached in an alignment and an agreement, right? When you have a lot of power, let's say at the product management level or the engineering management level, then it's more of a delegation or rank that gets to vote on the decision. How do you balance the two? Because they're completely different cultures. And the community decisions and having everybody's voices heard may be more beneficial for Agile, but that could also lead in the wrong direction if, let's say, somebody with a higher level of management knows a little bit more details than simply the team does. So, how do we find that balance? Because I think a lot of times we offer voice to everybody and then people get upset if they're outranked with a decision, and vice versa. Some people feel like they're not given a chance to even contribute.
Yeah. So there's a couple things going on there. Number one, you're right, it's a balance, right? And there are certain things that leaderships in in the best position to decide. Usually that's very high level stuff like business outcomes, business strategy, things like that. And those are both things that we probably want to hold pretty fast to. And when you think about strategy, like a good strategy helps everybody in the company make decisions faster on their own. First of all, leadership can't be everywhere, right? So it's not practical to have them make all the decisions. Number two, they may or may not be the smartest people in the room. I'd rather be as smart as the reason why I bring somebody into my organization is because they have something to contribute, right? And I want them to be able to do that. And one of the ways that you can do that is if you have a clear strategy that helps people make decisions. When there's some confusion over different choices, the strategy helps you make that decision. And I think the military has this concept of mission command.
Mm-hmm.
We'll tell you what the mission is, right? What the objective of the mission is. And then you guys who are out there on the actual front, you guys get to decide how to best implement that because you have all the local information and you have all the expertise of your team there to decide that. So that's generally how you can combine those two things. I think the other thing that's really important is that besides the local knowledge and things like that is the autonomy, right? And there's something called self-determination theory, which kind of talks about when people get into the zone of optimal performance and engagement and things like that. And the three parts to that, one is autonomy, right? So do people feel like their voice matters, like they have a chance to control their own destiny to a certain extent? And then there's competency, which is, are you putting them in a position where they can do the job? And then there's relatedness, which is, do they understand the mission? How are they connected to the mission? Do they have the relationship with the customers and things like that, right? And when you have all three of those things, then you're really cooking with gas, so to speak. It's important to develop that because without that, people aren't going to be as engaged and they're not going to be willing to voice their opinions and things like that.
So, Gary, we're getting to the top of the hour here. I wanted to open up the mic for any suggestions, recommendations, or anything you want to offer to anybody watching.
Yeah, we covered a lot of ground, which was good. I would say this is, let's figure out a way, if you're a leader, figure out a way to align your incentives with collaborative work because you want to encourage cross-functional work. And when people are siloed, not only is it slower because you have the handoffs and things like that, but everybody's out to get their own. And so that's definitely one thing. Some of the things that we talked about in terms of uncertainty, recognizing that uncertainty and not pretending that it doesn't exist. Don't just put your project as green because you don't want to talk about it or whatever.
85% complete.
Exactly. Yes. I was very binary on that. Either it's done or it's not done, right? And I know it takes a little bit of courage sometimes. And the one thing I'll throw out there is if you're afraid that your culture is not going to, at the present time, support some of those ideas, is start to plant a few seeds. There's this concept of an Overton window in political science, the range of opinions on a topic that are acceptable to talk about without being ostracized. And like the same thing exists within companies. So if you think getting rid of project status meetings is like something that is not really acceptable right now, just start to plant the seeds with different people. Hey, did you see what this company is doing? I heard that they now do this and they talk about what they've learned instead of just focusing on delivery risk, things like that. I start planting seeds, and it may not be today, it may not be tomorrow, but eventually enough people will start to mull the ideas over. It'll start to maybe get some traction.
I like that. Influencing change, I think, is an undervalued skill. But there's so much you can do. You can route the entire teams behind it, and you don't have to be super duper aggressive. All you have to do is just provide sufficient examples and go, I think we recognize a little bit of ourselves in this. Maybe this is something we ought to try.
Right. And if you can make space for experimentation, make it safe for people to try different things because you don't like the current result you're getting. Like, those two things, I think, go a long way. Forget about what methodology you use, or even if you use a methodology. But if you do those couple things, I think you will see change happen in your organization.
Awesome. Thank you, Gary. Really enjoyed the conversation. It was an in depth one. Hopefully, we can do more in the future. The topics are unlimited here. It's the
True, yeah.
Pandora box. Every week, there's some other news that comes out, and the practice itself is still very valid. I'm always reminded by the Winston Churchill's quote about democracy. Hey, democracy, it's the worst form of government. Unfortunately, there's not a better one. And
Well,
I feel like the Agile is the same way.
and I think some people would say the same thing about capitalism, right? It's not perfect, but it may be better than all the alternatives. And I think we keep getting better at the software development thing. And we just need to continue to adapt and be open to new ideas and continue to get better, hopefully.
Thanks again, Gary. Thanks everybody for watching. And if you have any questions or anything, please comment below, click subscribe, and we look forward to hearing from you.